First off, thanks again to the National Institute for Civil Discourse. They're all standing in the back over there. They have done some excellent yeoman work in making all this possible, and they have been very generous with their space on here. We appreciate you guys, and we will look forward to working with you guys for many things in the future. And thank you again to American Purpose Magazine who helped us promote this and who does various events with us. My name, again, is Luke Phillips. I work for Braver Angels, and I direct what we are colloquially calling for now the Braver Angels DC project. So Braver Angels, for those of you who know what it is, remains what it is. We are a nationwide, grassroots-led, fully red-blue citizens movement committed to helping Americans across all political, cultural, and social divides find the value in each other and helping them practice the arts of political discourse in ways that do honor to the relationships which, at the end of the day, are the most important things in our personal lives and our common life, which no politician and no politics should ever destroy. Our work in political depolarization is based on family therapy models, and everything we've ever done in workshops, in debates, in local organizing, in media, and all of our engagement proceeds from the assumption that we don't need to change the ways we think about politics, policy, ideas, ideology, or grand issues. We only need to change the way we think about each other if we're going to have a healthier political discourse. And if we do that, we're doing the best work we can to hold ourselves to the right standards and treating our fellow citizens, no matter what our political convictions or their political convictions might be. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean we don't engage in politics at a question of policy and a question of ideology and a question of the great issues of any day. In fact, there is no politics without any of that. And so in the Braver Angels Debates program, and Braver Angels Media, and in various other initiatives, we try to help people talk much more specifically and closely about those. The main purpose of the Braver Angels DC project, aside from helping organize the multifarious things we do around Capitol Hill and with college students and other things, will be to set up some formal programming specifically engaging the policy intellectual world at policy intellectual worlds level. Talking about the great ideas, talking about the great debates of our contemporary political discourse, and trying to think where we all stand in the current strains of political history, how that relates to where we've been, how that relates to where we've been going, and seeing what, if any, relevance civil discourse, bipartisanship, depolarization, bridge building, treating each other as fellow citizens has for great questions of American ideology. Now, I am biased as somebody who myself came to Braver Angels not at a therapeutic level, but at a strangely neurotic intellectual level. I think depolarization is actually a very intellectually serious thing. I think it has helped me understand some fundamental questions in political theory and some fundamental questions in political existence that I don't think I ever really fully comprehended before I was sitting around in a workshop with 9 other reds and 9 other blues talking about what brought us to our convictions. I think it helped me understand things about political subjectivity, about the ultimate context of all political and social life, and about the historicized lenses we are always viewing things in that I wouldn't have understood had I just been continuing my career as a journalist. So again, I'm biased. I think there is a really important role for depol work in intellect, and a really important role for intellect and depol work. But let's get through this conversation first and see if you all agree at the end of it, and then we can talk about next steps from there, perhaps. So in the meantime, this event tonight, you all are part of a select, wonderful group of Americans who are interested in hearing 3 individuals talk about the things that they nerd out over in their long dark nights of political theory, the interpretation of history, and the correct principles of regimes and all that sort of thing. Fun and light stuff. We thank you for joining us, and I could not be joined by 2 more interesting and lucid folks on some of these issues. So what we're going to be discussing tonight is going down to, I think, some of the foundations and dynamics of American polarization. Why are American parties polarized the way they are? Why are American political ideologies the way they are? What does that have to do with political coalitions? What does that have to do with being a political independent? What does that have to do with building new institutions? Does it have anything to do with those? How should we be thinking about creative new movements in American politics? Are we fundamentally condemned to have the same kinds of debates tomorrow that we've had for all of our lifetimes already, or are new things possible? And if new things are possible, what might those look like? I am joined by an individual who has written a whole book about that, and another individual who has been dedicating a lot of his volunteer time to exploring new methods of that. And so before we go into this, I'm going to give each of them a little chance to explain themselves, but at a quick level. So I'm joined on the my far right, your far left. I promise you that doesn't have any. Although horseshoe theory is a fascinating subject, we can talk about it a little bit later. By Frank DiStefano. Frank DiStefano is the author of a wonderful book called The Next Realignment. Remind me of the subtitle. It's Next Realignment, How America's Parties Are
Why American Parties Are Crumbling and What Happens Next.
And if anybody has watched the travails of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party anytime in the last 4 presidential election cycles or so, probably longer, Frank has a lot of stuff to explain there. So Frank has been doing a lot of interesting work on that. He also has an excellent YouTube channel and writes excellent essays for a couple publications that I care about very much. And the thing that has always made me interested in Frank's work is he, as Adam Garfinkel put it once to me, Frank developed the unified field theory of different cycles of American politics, political realignments, great awakenings in cultural and spiritual issues, and economic revolutions in ways that I think a couple people have tried, but Frank did it in the first manifesto style way. So Frank, thank you for your intellectual service on that. And we're happy to have you here. I don't send your stuff yet, though. I want to introduce Silas first. I'm second off joined by my former colleague and dear friend, Silas Kulkarni. Silas used to work with me in Braver Angels, and full disclosure, he was my direct supervisor for a while, and I'll be taking various pot shots in vengeance for that in a very Braver Angels spirit. Silas nowadays is directing the Forward Party in D.C. The Forward Party, obviously, is Andrew Yang's current political project, organizing citizens to do things that I don't think I can fully explain, so I'll let Silas explain some of it. But in terms of all the third-party and independent movements that have cropped up in American politics in the last 20 or 25 years or so, there's probably a lot of things that a lot of people can say about the Forward Party, but I have to say they have the best meme game out of all of them. So that's why I follow you guys pretty closely. And additionally, Silas is doing some streaming along with Frank, and sometimes and other times along with myself to bring various intellectuals who are thinking about the future of American politics together to think about these sorts of things. And what we're doing with you guys now is just thinking in public a little bit. I really do strongly believe that if we hold ourselves to higher standards of thinking in public, there are very good things that can do for those who act in public, and there's probably not a direct relation, but it at least gives them better things to rip out of. So we'll see. All right, with that, Frank, let me give you a couple minutes to discuss your thing. Yes, Silas.
Just for the event host, is it possible to get a small table for the water and the, if that's possible, that would be helpful. If not, don't worry about it. I'm sorry, Frank, I didn't mean to.
No problem.
And ICD, thank you for your help on that front. So, all right, Frank, tell us how American parties are changing and why.
Okay. All right. So I thought it was helpful to start today because we're talking about what can our new parties look like? Not just what's happening, but what is it that we want to build next? What can we build next? How do we start solving our problems? And that the best place to start with that discussion is just, all right, so what is a political party in the first place? What is it for? And a political party is, I think, it is a vehicle to somehow unite hundreds of millions of people, half the country, around a common story about what it is that is going wrong in America at a time and place, and what is the approach that is going to fix it. And when you think about that for a second, that is a staggering task, right? I mean, America is a democracy. So because it's a democracy, you need 50% of the people to actually enact an agenda to get things done. You need 50% of the country to cooperate. And not just cooperate for a minute, cooperate over time. And this is a country with 350 million people with very different values, with very different interests. And you need to get them to put all of the things that they differ about aside and come together on something, and that can only be whatever is the most important issue of their age, something that's so important that they will unite and then work together cooperatively for years and years and years at a time, so that we can actually get things done, so we can solve problems, so we can address the things that need to get addressed. And that's essential, because if government can't actually govern, if it can't actually solve people's problems, it loses its legitimacy and it will collapse. So that is really a task that we take for granted, because we live in a world of political parties and democracies, and we take it for granted that that is a normal thing. But that is it's a really difficult thing to do. And the only way you can do it is with essentially a big story. That story of what is our era's big crisis? What is this thing that we are all going to put all of our differences aside to work on fixing this, at least to get hundreds of millions of people to do this, and to have a common approach that we can cooperate on for years and years and years in the future to actually accomplish that. Now, the stories that we have to do that today, which is liberalism and conservatism, well, I think it's obvious to everybody right now why it is that those are no longer working, and that everything seems to be falling apart. And that is because these are stories that we developed in the middle of the 20th century as solutions to the problems of the middle 20th century. Liberalism, which came out of FDR and his New Deal, right? That was a new idea in 1932. The political parties that we had before were different. The way that we organized our people together in coalitions were different. The way we solved problems were different. And people, a lot of times, we take it for granted because we've lived in a world of these two fights of liberalism and conservatism throughout all of our lives, that it's always been that way. But it hasn't always been that way. It's only been that way for as long as we've been alive. It's all that we know. And we have this whole idea of this left-right spectrum that we take for granted, which is really just a description of the two parties that we've always known in our lives. But if you go back further, you have very different ways that we've organized ourselves. And of course, the human species, with all the infinite ideas in our imagination, it would be absurd to think that we break down always within only two camps, and that you could line up everything that we were fighting about and that we cared about into one line, as opposed to different coalitions that change and have to get reorganized over time as we have new issues. And we have these, so liberalism came up out of FDR to solve the problems of the 20th century, which it was this story that said that the problems of America, particularly after the Great Depression and Second World War, that the problems of America was we needed to use expertise in planning to organize things, that things that the modern world had become too complicated with industrialization and airplanes and global commerce, and that we needed a lot more coordination and expertise in planning, particularly that would benefit working people and the least well off. And so that was the story that came out of liberalism. And then in opposition to that, we have the story of conservatism, which was a counter reaction, which said, yeah, well, let's make sure we don't step on other American values that are also really important, things like liberty, and not just our personal liberty and also economic liberty, to make sure that that we have an economy that can work, that's not overmanaged, as well as that we have the other American values of national virtue that we're not trampling on. And so that was the story that came out of conservatives. And then if you go back further, of course, we've had other versions of our parties that have had different fights, which were about other periods of time with other sets of issues. All right. So the problem with those stories is there are stories about how to solve problems in the middle 20th century. That's when we developed them. That was their goal. And now we don't have the problems in the middle 20th century. We have the problems in the 21st century in information age economy and a new global world. And we have new problems like what to do about China and what to do about artificial intelligence and what to do about gene editing. And who knows what else is coming down the pike. And we have two sets of tools that were designed to solve problems of 50, 60, 70 years ago, and they don't fit. And so the whole thing is naturally coming apart, and it's creating a vacuum. And what do you get in a vacuum? You get people start trying to jump into the public square and grab a microphone. You get crazy people who would normally get pushed out of the system. Now that they can find a platform, you have a lot of discontent and people trying to struggle, and everything is falling apart. So then what has to happen next? Well, what always happens next in these eras like this is that we have to reinvent. We have to invent new stories that are dealing about how to solve whatever is our era's crisis. And we have to find a new way to address our era's crisis, a new approach. And it will break down into two new parties, whether they have new names or not new names is irrelevant. Sometimes they can still be called Democrats and Republicans, just like FDR's party was still called the Democrats, but it was very different from William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson's party that was called the Democrats. So it'll be a new party in form and having a new debate about a new set of problems. And so then that brings us back to our discussion today, which is what I think, if we're going to start talking about how do we design parties and new political ideologies and how do we solve our new problems, I think we have to start at the beginning, which is to say, okay, we're not just taking a grab bag and here's some issues that I like, right? I'm going to take all the issues that I care about, I'm going to throw them together, and that's going to be a party that represents me and gives me everything I want. And that's a childish way to look at politics, because obviously, in a country with 350 million people, the chance that your preferences just happen to be the ones that you get everything that you want and everybody else has to compromise is absurd. It's really a question of what is the crisis? What is our great crisis of our era? And then once we know what that is, that in a crisis is so big that we can get hundreds of millions of people to put their differences aside and work on that. And then what is our approach to solving it? What is the way that we're going to start addressing this so that we can actually do things and reform our system and make things better? Because if the government can't make things better and can't solve people's problems, we lose legitimacy and the whole society collapses. It's the whole purpose of politics. The purpose of politics isn't winning elections or being on television. The purpose of politics is to do things, to actually make the world a better place, to resolve our differences and to get things done. And so what we're going to talk about tonight about how to reform our politics, I think what we're really talking about is what is the crisis and what is the approach that we can unite people to solving it. And on that, we've all done a lot of thinking. I'm very, very interested in tonight in talking about that and seeing what other people think about what we have to think. But I also am really interested in hearing what you guys think, because as I said, this is only going to work. We got to unite 150 million people. And so we're all going to have to play a part in figuring out where's the point that we can come together to actually start solving all of our neglected problems of a world that has radically changed. And we've done nothing and neglected. We've been in stagnation for years. And so,
for what it's worth, I think it would be very well organized if we had at least two groups of 150 million people each organized in their own way.
Well, obviously. Okay. So that's all I have to say. So
I'd like a quick question of clarification for the
Sure.
audience. And if you can answer this in 2 sentences or less so that we can get to Silas's
Yes.
picks here.
that's probably more than 5 minutes. So.
Sorry. Is it your opinion that the Republican Party in the age of Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and I don't know, Ted Cruz, operates on more or less the same principles as the Republican Party of the age of Ronald Reagan, Bob Dole,
No.
and George Bush?
What I think has happened is we are in the collapsing part of the party system, right? Party systems have natural life where we form them, they're vibrant for a while, they start to collapse, fall apart, and then eventually they collapse and they get remade. And there's forces there to try to remake our parties in a certain way that I don't like. I don't think it's been very helpful, but I don't think that's solidified yet. So I think what has happened is the old Republican Party is dead. It has collapsed. There is now this vacuum.
Do you think
that
there's a
people
similar
are
trend
trying
on
to
the
fill.
Democratic Party or no?
What?
Do you think there's a similar trend in the Democratic
Yes,
Party?
I think the Democratic Party, I wouldn't say it's collapsed yet. I think it is, though, clearly stagnating and collapsing internally. It's holding itself together, but clearly, as we've seen, it can't get anything done. It can't agree on what needs to be done. It's basically sort of locked in stasis. And is just waiting to fall down for the same reason that it can't solve problems.
Great. hold that thought, and I will be curious to wargame both among these two and among the rest of y'all on what the factional coalitions fighting over the decaying carcasses of our two great venerable parties actually look like, and who is likely to win those. But
obviously the Forward Party.
in the meantime, let's hear from Silas of the Forward Party, what your thoughts are on everything that Frank said and how you're thinking about the themes that we're discussing generally today. And since Frank took 10 minutes, also take 10 minutes.
First off, I just wanted to say what an honor it is to be here. Luke, as well as a dear friend, is also a very self-deprecating individual. I think it's actually a virtue at a certain level, but is probably one of the most brilliant ideological thinkers I know. Certainly for a young man his age, he's a standout. And Frank is, frankly speaking, one of the greatest intellectual influences on the last several years of my life. I didn't know him when I started reading him. I was so deeply influenced by his book, The Next Realignment, which I could not recommend more to anybody concerned about this question, that I sought it out, became friends with him, and developed an ongoing intellectual and ideological friendship. So it really is an honor to be here today. In terms of the themes that Frank raised and the topic here, I think it's really important to recognize that we're really in a moment of great danger for our republic. Great danger. I worked my entire life in the field of racial and economic justice through the field of education. And around 2016, I got concerned such that I no longer work in education, I work in politics now. Something seemed different, something seemed wrong, and it got worse from there. And I think if anything confirmed my worst fears, it was January 6th when I was here in DC, and as most of you probably were. I never thought I would see a moment like that in my lifetime. And I think that for most of us, there's this sense that we don't really say out loud, but it's somewhere in the back of our necks. We think, Rome fell, the British Empire fell, but America shall never fall. We are eternal. We don't say anything like that. It sounds pompous to say, but if you look at the assumptions we make about how the world works, they're premised on the assumption that everything will work and will continue to work, at least for us. And I just don't think that's true anymore. I think that's up for grabs. And I think that if we had the humility to look historically, we would say, actually, nothing works in perpetuity. Things require maintenance. They require nurturance. And our democratic system, as durable as it has been, is in need of some serious overhaul. That's the moment I see upset. That's why I joined up with the Forward Party, having been a lifelong Democrat, throwing my hat in with something that seems as far-fetched as starting a new party, which hasn't happened literally since 1865 is the last time a new party that
1856.
Thank you, Luke. In terms of that moment, I think it's really important to also understand that what is bringing about this moment, because we are in a moment of profound change. To name just a few of the massive factors within America, demographic change. We will soon be a majority non-white nation for the first time in our history. And that majority non-white will also not just be, two races. It will be quite a diversity, quite a complexity. Economic change. Though this is somewhat cyclical and has happened before, the levels of inequality and the nearly hereditary nature of that inequality are growing to levels that are, in my view, untenable. Global change. Our global position is frankly not what it once was. From having gone from the bipolar world of the Soviet Union and the United States to the unipolar world in the aftermath of the fall, now we have several rising powers that could challenge us and are frankly challenges in us right now. China most certainly highest among them, but if we look at this on the 50-year view, not on the 5-year view, thinking about India, thinking about other regional competitors with like Russia, as obviously on our minds right now. The global system is no longer settled in the way that it was for some time. And moreover, we are deeply interconnected in that global system. We have a globalized economy in a way that has never existed in the history of our species. And that is driven by what I think is actually probably the most profound driver of change, which is the technological one. The Industrial Revolution upended everything that people assumed about the way that the world worked. And many of the changes in the American party system of the past were responses to the Industrial Revolution. In many ways, the New Deal was a response to the inequality that was driven by the Industrial Revolution and the instability in boom and bust. And now we are in the midst of this technological revolution with the internet and likely soon to be artificial intelligence. And it is affecting us minute by minute of our lives. It is affecting teenagers in how they socialize. It is affecting each of us in how we do our job on a daily basis, literally down to the Zooms that we spend all our time on. I can't stand. It's like very nice to see you in person. It is affecting how we relate to the economy and to international politics. So in the face of all these changes, the old answers don't work. But when you look at the political system, as Frank was alluding to, it feels like nothing's changed since the 1930s. Like you could literally cut and paste text of speeches and they wouldn't seem that out of step, except for a few terminological differences. Moreover, the ability to do anything seems to be draining out our system by the day. And so in that context, Americans have lost faith. There are an extremely large number of metrics which show that every institution in American society, from the church to the police, to the government, to the universities, literally everyone has declined, most of them, like they're falling off a cliff in the trust that they hold among the American populace. You cannot have a society that functions without trust in institutions. In many ways, the COVID pandemic revealed how the lack of trust in institutions could lead to literal death on a massive scale. And in particular, the meta institution of our society, the political party system, that leads to getting things done, solving problems or not, strikes me as the most broken of all. There are many different statistics that you could look at to answer this. The one that comes to my mind, and this is obviously because I'm involved in the movement for a multi-party democracy, is the percent of Americans who want a new choice in politics. 62%, an all-time high, according to, I believe this is Gallup, 62% of Americans want a third party right now. And the phrasing of the question is so aggressive. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to read it to you because I think it's worth understanding. This is not just, would you like a third party? This is the actual Gallup question, if you'll indulge me.
Then you'll have to indulge me right after you read this. I'm serious.
Okay. So the specific question that is asked on the poll says, do you agree or disagree? The two parties do such a poor job representing the American people that a third party is needed. It's not just would you like a third party, it's, do you agree that they do such a poor job representing people?
Okay, so indulge me. I know you have a lot to say, but we have a lot to get to. And so assume that everybody in this room and everybody who's going to watch this YouTube video agrees with you and Andrew Yang and everybody else completely that we do need a multi-party democracy. Tell me in the next 3 minutes why and how multi-party democracy addresses everything that Frank brought up better than a two-party system with different factions inside the parties.
Sorry, I have to give a little bit of a segue there because we're getting there, but there's a connection point here.
Great.
So in the face of this dysfunctional stagnation and these new challenges needing new answers, I'd say that you have three choices in society. Really, actually, they boil down to two, and I'll break the second one into two parts in a second. One part, just let it keep going until it collapses in a violent cataclysm. And by the way, this is what happened in the Civil War. There was a party system that refused to adjust and to solve the big problems of the day. We had a literal civil war. That's one possibility, collapse. The other possibility is make a radical reform. Frank would argue for, and I am drawn to the thesis that a party realignment could create a new set of functionality. But I think that the other alternative, and the one that I will advocate for, is the idea that we don't just need two new parties, we need to move to a multi-party democracy, as most of the world has. That's and for those who don't understand the Forward Party is in some sense a meta party. It has a loose ideology that is, you could say, radically centrist, but its primary driving purpose is actually to create the systemic reforms possible to create a multi-party system. So we actually hope to have not a new third party, but 5 parties, 6 parties, like most of our peer nations in the Western world has. One of the reasons why I believe that that would start to solve problems is because you could create unlikely bedfellow coalitions. So I'll give you an example. There is a huge part of what you might call the populist right in America, who is socially conservative, but would be very happy with a much deeper, better, and more generous system of social safety net, things like Medicare expansion. And that will never pass because of the Republican coalition as it is. Likewise, there's a part almost untalked about, and I hope we get into this discussion, of the Democratic Party, mostly people of color, who, contrary to the assumptions of typical discourse, would prefer many institutions of traditionalist society. They vote Democrat for reasons like I do, like the sense that we are on the chopping block from the right, that we're literally being targeted as the enemy, but actually have none of the modern liberal progressive ideologies around gender, sexuality, the family, any of these kinds of things, and who would favor certain much more, I'd say moderate, not extreme, traditionalist social policies. Those could pass in a multi-party system, because in a multi-party system, those coalitions could emerge and then reform. It's not all or nothing. You don't have to agree on everything to pass anything. And what's more, we have a super majoritarian system in the United States. You can't pass things with 50% majorities, and that's exactly what the Democrats are facing now. We have so many checks and balances, so many layers of government, that you need supermajorities. Supermajorities are incredibly hard to sustain, and have become harder to sustain, particularly as our society has diversified not just demographically, but in all ways. And I think this is driven by the internet. There's such a individualism of our political and social life now that forming those supermajorities is, to my mind, a fool's errand. And so the ability to move flexibly between different coalitions where you have 60% of the population that does support one policy, but it's not the same 60% of the population would support another policy, will allow us to solve problems in a way that we never have. And by the way, if you look around the world, it tends to produce that effect more reliably and decrease some of the toxicity and polarization that has to do with why all of us are here today and why all of us are, or at least many of us, are connected to the institution of brave angels.
So in the context of everything Silas and Frank just talked about, there's at least 3 spectrums of polarization you can think about. There's the legacy one that Frank discussed. There's the fact that you have a Republican and a Democratic Party, and that Republican and that Democratic Party are both vaguely in something you might think of as liberalism and as conservatism, as in the Democratic Party's liberalism, of which the great Will Rogers once upon a time said, "I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat." And the conservative movement influenced Republican Party, of which you might nowadays say, "I'm not a member of any organized ideological movement, I'm a conservative." Yeah. Right? So you have those two kind of, like, I don't know, I like to think of them as zombie coalitions of sorts, right? Like the Republican and the Democratic Party. Boomers are Republicans and Democrats because they grew up as Republicans and Democrats. And sometimes you hear discourse nowadays that is almost like the 80s never ended or the 90s never ended, right? Which is fair because in some ways they didn't. But to both of your points, a lot of ways they did. So that's one thing. R&D, red and blue, are those deep identities? Probably not necessarily, but they're kind of casual identities. Then you have the really hot button things that everybody who has a podcast necessarily like traffics in and makes all the discourse stupider. Frankly, my single biggest rule of journalism, writing, whatever, is like, thou shalt not make people stupider in what you put out. I try to hold myself to that. I don't think I succeed all the time, but let us all try to hold ourselves to that too. So you have this like big negative anti-coalitions. You have a certain group of Americans, a lot of them who are Republicans, a lot of them who are in different parts of the left, the intellectual dark web, certain kinds of socialists who think that the single greatest threat to the republic is something vaguely nebulously called wokeness or political correctness or something along those lines, right? We all know their podcasts, we've all seen their writings, all that kind of thing. Then you have a direct counter to that, and you have a certain group that is a lot of people on the left, a lot of Democrats, but also a lot of what we think of as never Trump Republicans and certain kinds of libertarians and traditionalists who think that the single greatest threat to the Republic is something vaguely called Trumpism or MAGA or something like that. And so in these two coalitions, which again are rooted kind of in the old style of polarization, but not entirely, and when people do bipartisan stuff, normally it's like anti-Trump Republicans, anti-Trump Democrats saying that they're bipartisan, and anti-woke Republicans, anti-woke Democrats saying that they're bipartisan. You know? Like you see how this is going here? So you have that frame of polarization. Those two frames are how most Americans and most times experience things. But then here in the nation's capital, here in the greatest city in the world, here in Washington, D.C., you have unique tribes of useless intellectuals like me who go and do all kinds of stuff like what Frank's saying, like what Silas is saying. How do we build new things? And let me just open up a few of those possible tribes for you guys. Frank, you've introduced me to a group of people who I did not notice earlier, but I'm glad you did. Who consider themselves to be supply-side neoliberals and supply-side, sorry, not supply-side progressives. Supply-side progressives, people who are in a generally technocratic, but also free market and also socially moderate kind of view. I think you mentioned Ezra Klein and Ideologies, others like this. Roger Karma is a dear friend of mine, and he's been doing some stuff on that. So you have them. They're vaguely Democrats, but they have different common grounds otherwise. Then you have what you might think of as the state capacity libertarians, people who have been in the libertarian movement for a long time, who go read Brian Kaplan's stuff over at his Substack and read what's his name? What's the really good his name's on the tip of my tongue, and I think he's been a marketist.
Frank Lindsay.
Frank Lindsay is good. Frank Lindsay is good. There's another one. It'll come back to me later, and I'll just put it out. Sorry, but yeah, you have state capacity libertarians who have a standard recognizably libertarian idea, but they're all about establishing a deeper and more proactive role for the state in various ways, right? So you have that. You have a bunch of different kinds of nationalist conservatives who are the ones who, Silas, you mentioned, have a very traditionalist and socially conservative understanding of society, but are nowadays pushing for an activist understanding of government on the conservative side and things like labor and trade and stuff like that. Full disclosure, I've basically been one of those for a while, although I was that before it got cool, and once it got cool, it became something else. So we got uncool. But then you have certain kinds of social democrats and democratic socialists, right? The Bernie Sanders types, and people have told me that Ro Khanna kind of hops between footseeing with them and footseeing with the political center, which I think is a fascinating kind of political dynamic. Then you have people who are trying to transform politics through tech, and they go from everywhere from reactionary to boring centrist to futurist revolutionary to post-humanist stuff. And they have positions at think tanks in DC and have apparently proactive policy relevant ideas. So stuff like that. Basically, you have this like constellation that runs the gamut from the vital center, this notion that the current regime as it is basically good and needs to be shored up and reformed, all the way to what you might think of as like the radical center or the post-liberal center or something that has huge, deep critiques, either from the right or the left of the regime as it exists. Let's not define the regime, but all these different ideological dispensations, these kind of track with wokeness versus Trumpism, Republican versus Democrat, but not quite. And so I'm wondering what you two think. Let's just do a little bit of wargaming here. If you two had to build two coalitions just out of, again, useless intellectuals like me here in Washington, D.C., what would those two coalitions be? What would those two visions of the future American politics look like? And also, y'all in the audience, we're going to get to Q&A sometime soon here. And if any of you have creative ideas that you can phrase in 4 sentences or less, I would actually be curious to hear some of your thoughts on this.
I have one comment before I'm going to do your wargaming, but I had a thought before then, something that you said that I think is important to recognize. When you're talking about the way coalitions, the sort of the the Trump coalition and the woke fight, okay. A lot of times I wonder if we're in the 1850s, okay? So for anybody here who knows what happened in the 1850s, so the Whig Party went down in 1852. The Republican Party in the Civil War is 1860. So there's 8 years there. Well, what was that 8 years about? Well, predominantly the know-nothings. The know-nothings who we've forgotten all about and written out of history, okay? And the know-nothings were this anti-immigrant, highly patriotic rhetoric movement. They were all about the Constitution and stating the Constitution, but wrapped in there was this idea that the Pope was engaged in conspiracy to send Catholic immigrants to the United States to overthrow the country. So they were basically sort of nuts. They were very radical, and for a time they controlled the United States Congress. The Speaker of the House was a no-no. Okay, so that's was going on in that transition period. And I think about that a lot because again, the know-nothings were for about 4 years the second major party in America. Basically, the Whigs had gone down and the know-nothings briefly replaced them until the Republicans had to get formed, got organized, and then pushed the know-nothings off the stage, and then we had Republicans and Democrats. I think of sometimes with this woke stuff, I wonder how much of that is going to last into the future, because I think when you're in a political vacuum, you get stuff like the know-nothings. And people, and all the issues that the know-nothings care about just vanished. They didn't vanish necessarily, but that's not what we frame politics about, because ultimately when we create two new political movements, they have to be useful, they have to solve problems, they have to unite half the country around a productive agenda. And if you can't do that, if it's not enough to do that, or what you're fighting about is sort of resentments and anger, and it's not a productive agenda, it can't, you can win a couple elections on it, but it can't sustain a party over time, and it'll eventually come apart. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we look at what's happening right now today, and then graph that forward forever, that what we're fighting about right now is going to be what we're going to fight about for the next 30 years. And I look at when I try to figure out what we're going to be fighting about for the next 30 years, I think, well, what are the problems we have to solve, and how can we divide the country into half into a debate about what to do about it? Because I think that's what's sustainable. I think anything that's not that is going to be transitional, because again, you can win an election on just, I'm really mad at these people. They're blame them for all your problems and all that kind of anger, but you can't sustain it. Okay, so that was but now stepping back to the question that you started with, which is,
moderators always love it when they do that, by the way. So
well, it was a digression. So I
I
wanted to pull it back to the important question, which is, how can we organize a party with this stuff? And I think what you said, which I thought was really interesting, because it's what I think too, what was laced into your question without saying it was that none of these things are sufficient by themselves, which I agree with. I think there's all these movements that are happening to come up with a new agenda for America, but most of them are focused on one small area. So we said like supply side progressivism, which is something that I've been very interested in, because I think it has a lot of energy. I don't know if anyone's been paying attention to this, but there's a lot of energy in center left to reinvent. Everyone's been focused on Trumpism and stuff, but there's also this big fight happening right now in the center left about reinventing the Democratic Party. And the critique essentially is that the Democrats have been focused too much on redistributing things, assuming that there's a certain amount of stuff in society and redistributing. And if what you do is just redistributing and you don't make more of it, the price goes up. So for example, if you look at college tuition, right? So if you try to create access by giving people more money for college, the price of college rises, versus supply side progressivism would try to solve that same problem by making more stuff. Instead of trying to give people more money to buy a limited amount of stuff and just watching the price rise and access not increase, maybe the solution is we need to be more productive. We need to make more stuff, which then gets into something that sounds very sort of free market libertarian in a way. It sort of merges progressivism with free market libertarianism, which says we need to build more. We need to, start bringing manufacturing capacity to the United States. Now we start sounding a little bit like the national conservatives.
Mhm.
All right.
Mhm.
So this has been, so that's what the supply side progressive critique has been all about. So it's very interesting, but again, it's mostly an economic critique. And it solves economics, but then, there's a lot of social changes going on. There's also China. What do we do about China? There's so many different points that have to be combined together. All right. So if I had to make a party right now, I think what I would do, I would start with that and the state capacity libertarianism,
Mhm.
and and then I would use the Yuval Vin's critique on leadership and meritocracy.
Mhm.
I think on the right, I would take that from the center left, that from the right, and so supply side progressivism is this idea on we need to build more stuff, and I think that really resonates with people. I think it's true. I think that we've been stagnating. Our infrastructure is terrible. Every time I get on a plane and leave the country and I come back, I'm depressed because I just look around and you get on the highway and you're like, our country looks like backwards. We need to build more stuff. We need to create more jobs. We need to create more education. We need to create more healthcare. We are not making enough stuff. And if we make more stuff, the price comes down. And so that sounds great. There's also the state capacity stuff. We need to vastly increase the ability of our government to do things. That our government is stagnating, our bureaucracies, and you look at what the CDC has just done in the last couple of years, right? This was supposed to be the gold standard agency of the United States. I look at the CDC and I say, I believed in 5 years ago, every time there was a movie and there was a zombie outbreak or a virus, and they would call it the CDC, and it was like,
The heroes.
the heroes, the cavalry's coming, CDC. The geniuses who are really organized know what they're doing are here, and they're going to save us, right? And then you look at what the CDC did and the FDA, it just shows the rot throughout the entire bureaucratic structure of the United States. We can't seem to get our act together to do things. And then the other critique of it, of leadership, and this is more than just government leadership, it's also society.
Mm-hmm.
It's all of our it's a critique of our institutions, including the media, corporations, Silicon Valley. Our institutions, I think there's a lot of resentment that people feel like our institutions don't do what they say. We can't trust them. That they say the right thing, but they don't actually live up to their promises. And I think that's broadly true. And I think there's a critique there of a lack of leadership in the country.
So build stuff, state capacity, critique of meritocracy.
And unleash, but let's now, because I always start one step higher, the goal is to take a country that's an industrial era country,
Mhm.
which is where we're at now,
Mhm.
with industrial era institutions,
Mhm.
with the assumptions in every institution that people live like they did in 1960, and drag it into the modern age.
Do you think Silicon Valley people and tech futurists would be into this kind of party?
Yes.
Okay. What is the best possible version of the counterparty that would rise up against this party in your view? Like, what would, no, seriously. What's the best possible party that would be on the other side and would have a very
And that's a really important question, right?
That
Everything's
would-
yin yang.
And not only that would counter it, but it would be the kind of people who would be bipartisan with this party at some times in the future. What
I don't know if it would be, you'd have a fight, right?
Yes.
So this party.
Sometimes they make up.
Yeah, this party would be I look at this party, I think it's a very Teddy Roosevelt party.
Mhm.
So then I have to assume that the response would be William Jennings Bryan's party. I think it would say that it would be populist in the sense it would say, you guys are just a bunch of elites, and what you're trying to do is this sort of elite version of America. You're not looking out for, I think it would probably be a working people's party that would try to devolve power. I think it would be pro decentralization because the Teddy Roosevelt party would be pro doing stuff with government. I think it would still be very anti-government, very Jeffersonian. It would be very working people, and it would be very national versus international. I think that and what's very interesting about this, which is again what's interesting about the progressive stuff, is the first party would be looking out for working people, but I don't think working people would vote for it, which is very much how the progressive movement Mm-hmm. Was where the progressives were very concerned about Irish immigrants in cities who voted Democrat and who voted for the machines that the progressives hated. And that's okay. So I think it would be something like that. But when you say the most positive version of it, what would they be? What would be their alternative? Would they just be I think you look at every party system, there's two different versions. There's two agenda parties or agenda opposition, right? So agenda opposition is what we have now. New Deal Democrats have an agenda of reform. The conservative coalition is an opposition party ultimately that's united around, that's a bad idea. We should not do that. Now, it doesn't mean they don't have agendas and things they want to do. Opposition parties always have agendas and reforms they want to do.
Frank, do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, that's probably, I'm talking too much.
So real quick, Frank, thank you for this. And the same question will go to Silas, although Silas, I assume you have a multi-party version of this, which I'm excited to
Okay.
hear what you guys think.
Part of my feeling listening to this was, think of this kaleidoscope of different forces. And do we really believe that we're going to group those into two big forces? So I think that that's implausible. And I want to talk a little bit about how I think the internet drives the implausibility of that, because I think Frank, in his book, I think has raised the most important framing. What is the question that all of our politics are driving to answer over the next generation, not over the next 3 years, not 5 years, but over the next 50 years? What is the question? And questions like the Industrial Revolution were questions. For me, that question is the internet.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the only question. I think it's actually the one that underlies all the other questions. But one of the core things that the internet does is it creates micro silos, mini tribes. You have people who have these super unique identities, but suddenly they're in a cluster with 1,000 other people with that super unique identity because they're connected across a vast geography. Identities that would have just been, off in space before now gain momentum. There's one of my favorite writers on religion in my life outside of the Forward Party, which is not my paid profession, it's my civic activism. In my life outside of the Forward Party, I work in a faith-based context. And one of my favorite writers about faith is Tara Isabel Burton. If you've ever heard of the book Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, I could not recommend it more. And I couldn't recommend it more in the context of this discussion, because she observes American religious life through the prism of the internet and through a globalized economic capitalist system, and concludes, I think rightly, that the massive rise in secularization is not actually secularization, but rather is what she calls religious remixing. Everybody's inventing their own religions in super micro categories. So she talks about people who literally identify as resistance witches, which is like a group of lefty Democrats who kind of believe in magic, maybe. Again, this is like a real thing. I'm not making this up. She talks about the incel movement. If you've never heard of the incel movement, it means involuntary celibacy. It's a lot of young men, mostly young white men, who are angry about the current gender and sexual relationships that they've grown up in that were not the ones that they knew how to navigate, and have a very reactionary, often violent kind of disposition. She talks about all these different movements in the context of religion, but they're all driven by this fragmentation of the internet. And by the way, I would say that the geopolitical situation is also driven by the fragmentation of the internet. Like, if you think about terrorism on the one hand and Russian disinformation on the other hand. So in the context of the great challenge of our generation, or of many generations to come, in my mind, is internet and this advancing technology and the fragmentation it causes, I think that a multi-party democracy is the only reasonable solution. Let me just add one last point about this, to going back to your war games question. I'll keep referring to Frank's book because it's so influenced me and I can't recommend enough. He charts these changes in party systems. First, you have the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republican Democrats. Then you have the Whigs and the Democrats. Then you have the Democrats and the Republicans at the era of the Civil War, which is like Lincoln's Republicans, not what we think of as Republicans. Then you have the progressive versus the William Jennings Bryan versus the Democrats. Then you have the New Deal and the conservative movement reaction. And then it stops. And when I say it stops, society doesn't stop changing, but the political parties' ways of framing their ideologies stop changing. Primarily, they are endurable. And political scientists have charted party systems. This is the longest lasting one that we've had. That's weird. It's strange that there's this unwillingness of the political parties to remake themselves in the way they have multiple times in history. It used to be 30 to 60 years that would happen. Now we're almost nearing 100 that hasn't happened. And I would argue that a lot of that inability to remake themselves is related to this bureaucratic sclerosis. You know, the barriers to creating new institutions and changing institutions have built up and built up as our government has gotten more complex. And so when I say that I think we need a multi-party democracy, I think we need to create a society that can be more nimble to the complexity and the fragmentation that is the defining theme of our literally next 100 years.
I just want to state for the record that I strongly, in fact, very polarizingly disagree with Frank and Silas on this. I happen to think that the Republican Party after the late 70s or so, and the Democratic Party after the late 70s or so are meaningfully different than the Republican and Democratic parties of the 1930s. The Republicans of Reagan and Democrats of like Ted Kennedy are meaningfully different enough from those of like Franklin Roosevelt and Nelson Rockefeller and Dwight Eisenhower to open up another thing. But that being said, that's a conversation we have to have specifically.
I actually agree with you on that, but general consensus of political science doesn't, and I think that's a worthy topic of engaging.
I am more than happy to be against the general consensus.
I have to say, of my whole book, this is the thing that comes up all the time. Everybody is obsessed with the idea that the 60s was some kind of realignment because of the demographic shift in the Solid South and because of new issues.
Well, but that's the thing. The new issues, they weren't just, I agree that it wasn't really quite economic issues.
Wait, I would love to discuss it with you guys.
Okay.
I want to hear from them.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. Let's.
Yeah, this is a side discussion, which I would love to debate
Here's what
because
we're
I'm
gonna do.
right.
We're going to discuss this a little bit, but let's everybody assume that questions are open, so start raising your hands, and I'm going to keep pummeling these guys with my idea here. Raise your hands, especially if you have ideas about what these new framings would, while I get a quick response from these two. So raise your hands and I'll open up a little order. Real quick. The cultural issues of the 1960s and the 1970s, and that's when the modern religious right, the modern conservative movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement that turned into the Watergate babies in the modern Democratic Party, happened in ways that pushed a certain kind of Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey Democrat, and a certain kind of Eisenhower, Rockefeller Republican further away from the voter bases of their parties than they had ever been before. And even if that didn't change the economic calculus of the parties, it certainly hugely changed the cultural dynamics of both of those parties. And I think cultural issues and economic issues in American politics are at least on par as being important in shaping party coalitions, if not constantly changing things. Okay, so you're right. Sorry for opening up too much. Let's go to a question from here.
Was that a hit and run or what?
Yeah, that was a hit and run. I'll take it though.
The wonderful hat up front.
All right, thank you.
Please tell us your thoughts, tell us your question, and tell us who it's
very much a hit.
and also tell us who you are.
Hello, my name is Max Maffa. I am a policy analyst with a China portfolio, actually. So if you have questions about Chinese, I can do that. One of the things that I feel like, in the historical analysis of like the trajectory of the like major sort of like political discourse over the 20th century, I feel like there was sort of like a yawning lacuna that I was hoping you could address, which is essentially why the idea of kind of like the Clinton era and then also essentially New Labour, the UK equivalent, did not represent a significant break with earlier dynamics. Why was that? Why because like that? I feel like the general consensus is that did not represent a change. My feeling has always been that it was a pretty big shift. So I was hoping just to hear justification.
Yeah. All right. So this is the whole idea of triangulating, right? The idea of triangulating, and we were just talking earlier about the previous triangulator. It's also Woodrow Wilson. Right? So this is not just a Clinton New Labour thing. This is a thing that happens. Okay. If the other guys are winning and their ideas are popular, there is a tactic where you take my ideology and I co-opt your issues. I try to accomplish the goals that are popular that you're doing, but I don't do it the way you want to do it. I do it with my ideology, right? So what Clinton was doing, what New Labour was doing was taking New Deal liberalism as an ideology and solving the problems that the Republicans were popular on doing it, but not by doing it the Republican way, by doing it the Democratic way, to achieve the goal with their ideology, which is like Woodrow Wilson, who was a progressive, right? Well, Woodrow Wilson was a small government progressive. Okay, progressivism was about using government and social science and expertise to solve problems. And Woodrow Wilson came in, and that was the whole big fight with Teddy Roosevelt, where he said, yeah, we're going to do your stuff, but this is the, Teddy Roosevelt is new nationalism, and he came up with new freedom. And the idea of new freedom was, we're going to use a Jeffersonian small government approach to do all the things you want to do. So a lot of progressive policies passed under Wilson, but the progressives often hated him and he was dragging his feet. He wasn't a progressive, but he created those policy goals. Bill Clinton, right? If you look at what Bill Clinton said, you'd say, we're going to welfare as we know it. But I don't think anyone thinks Bill Clinton was a free market conservative.
There are some people who do think.
But he wasn't. I mean, he wasn't ideologically a free market conservative. He realized that to win elections, he needed to take those.
Silas, do you have a thought on this?
I'm going to try to keep this very focused. The thing that defines party systems is what's the big question or problem that everybody's trying to solve, and what are the two, or in my argument, multiple approaches to solving it. And so Bill Clinton was basically trying to solve the same questions, and he was basically working with a similar coalition, just as Frank said, framing it in a way that could appeal to get some crossover appeal in an era where Reagan's ideology was most dominant.
Yeah, if we can get a microphone to this gentleman on the front left over here, please, or the middle left. Yes, thank you. Now, I will say at some level, I think the politicians seem to have a different and more ability to tack and triangulate than intellectuals do, right? And so there's different levels of politics you're playing with direct policy people and people who are setting up new ideologies. But this is an interesting question that we should answer there. Sir.
I'm a Pierre international affairs analyst and a former diplomat. I'm okay with two parties, but I get this overwhelming sense we need some sort of charter of civility, that you really don't get to keep elected officials up all night by marching around their neighborhoods, that you really don't get to throw people out of restaurants because you disagree with them. But you can keep killing babies, but you can't do it the day before they're born. And most importantly, that half the population doesn't get to repeal Voltaire. I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. These seem to me to be elemental principles of civility that have vanished, and rather recently and rather thoroughly. And I want to see our charter of civility before we move forward. And we can, in fact, move forward with two parties with that charter at hand.
Thank you for that. Do you guys mind if I take this real quick?
Sure, go.
I think so. I agree with you. And by the way, is my microphone still on? Or I will work on fixing that. Sorry for that. I agree with you in at many levels of general principle. And I work for Gregor Angels, right? Like I think at some level, not only civility, but charity and magnanimity and humility are important things as the fundamental basis of politics. I think when we try to make them the fundamental precondition of all politics, I feel like that tends to be an uphill struggle because people will always use civility when it benefits them and not use civility when it doesn't benefit them. And there's no way around self-interested human nature to get around that. At some level, if you guys can help me with mics, I appreciate that. Yeah. At some level, I think the civility is something that should and can be cultivated for its own sake. And I think when you can have governments and elected officials do it, that's great. But I feel like the thing that I'm interested in, both at the level of depolarizing work on its own front and also among intellectual work, is how do you have the right sort of balance of ideological parties that even in a dearth of civility, which we see nowadays, you can get stuff done in a practical way, and people who don't go to civility can still find the ways to it. This is actually an interesting thing that I don't want to talk too much, but let's talk about this afterwards because I think there's some interesting things here. Mia, can you take the microphone to April in the back here, please? Thank you.
Thanks. My name is April Cornfield. I'm also with River Angels, and my question is for Silas. I agree with you that the internet is the fundamental question to be solved. My question, however, you also said that trust in institutions is necessary for a society to endure in a stable fashion. And so my question is essentially, can the internet be solved in a way? Seriously.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Is this possible? Because it seems so corrosive to the institutions that are required to stabilize everything that I just don't know if this is a squareable circle.
That is a great question, and I just will be honest that framed as it is, can the internet be solved? I fear the answer is no. At the same time, as some I might disagree with, might argue about global warming, there might be some forms of resiliency. I actually think that if they had to divide into two camps instead of multipolar camps, I think that you could conceive of one as the futurist party and one as the traditionalist party. There's people who think the answer is, okay, we need more people to have more stuff. We need our tools to serve us. We can build our way out of this. We can invent our way out of this. And then there's people who say, no, actually, what we need is families and communities and get off your phone and go talk to your spouse and kids. I actually think that is a plausible alternative sets, one sort of material and one sort of spiritual answer to the question of how we deal with this reality of the internet. And I would add the broader technological changes we can't even envision, particularly AI.
Show of hands, who else has a question or a thought here? Let's take it to this gentleman in the back, Mia, in the blazer with no tie in the very back stand. Thank you.
My name is Dan Coffing with a company called Objectively, very interested in the public discourse challenge. But my question is, given if we accepted the summarized story of this is the antecedent party of the left and the right, et cetera, et cetera. I don't even want to argue that right now. Everything that we've cited as historical examples have all been representative of intellectual shifts, one way or the other, that then figured out some way to coalesce into either an extant party or eventually one of the parties went defunct and a new polar opposite party arose. And I'm interested to hear in the argument for moving beyond two parties, what is the distinct delta that says that intellectual coalition can't exist or will exist in a superior fashion in a multimodal rate rather than in making that coalition inside the existing two parties? Because we know that those coalitions happen all the time. Nobody gets everything that they want. They are always triangulating, cutting deals, what have you. And so why an argument for three parties if it's all intellectual shifting? By
the way, I wouldn't say three. I would actually favor myself 5, 6.
Take more, but it's still the same modality of an individual having to make I'm going to put all my eggs in the environmental basket versus the free market, whatever.
Yeah. So there's a strong argument. I always like to offer books that have influenced my thinking. There's a strong argument in a book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy, by Lee Drutman. If you haven't followed him, he's a scholar at New American Foundation. Strong argument in his books that actually America did have a multi-party system because the non-nationalization of politics allowed for Southern Democrats and Northeastern Democrats to be functionally unrelated parties, except for that there were coalitions. You had, in his argument, a 4-party system for example, the last era, and that 4-party system was just under this big tent. There's two things that I think make our situation particularly unique here. And we can talk a lot more about each of these, but I want to give a chance for more questions. One is the nationalization of politics, as I would connect it back to the internet, is such that every issue now comes back to which side you're on nationally in a way that was just never true in American history. And that's once again derivative of information technology and the flow of information. Two, I'd say that the demographic shifts that we're experiencing in America's long-standing period of two-party systems was largely a homogenous, not completely, but largely a political polity. The admission of all kinds of people who were never admitted there has led to some of these complexities that I think are not containable within two parties. There's a lot to say about that second one in particular, and I would really love to talk about the demographic angle of this, but I want to give more room for questions.
Raise your hands. Any other questions? Mia, can you bring it to this woman up front, please? Thank you.
Yeah. Less than you think, but yeah.
Hi, my name's Jesse. I'm a writer and editor, another one of the useless intellectuals.
I appreciate you. Where do you write it for?
A small startup magazine called Third Factor.
Great.
We talk about the psychology around this sort of like world changing, sort of we want to do something, addressing this sort of stage that we're in. It's right up my alley. I'm really excited to hear your ideas today. So on that note, we do a lot of, questioners come to us, and Frank said something early on about how so many people have, like, how can you expect a party to match all your ideas? But it seems, if you're the sort of person who does ask questions, that everyone else does just buy into the preset ideas. And yet when you start talking to people and you get them to reveal a little more, maybe they reveal, well, I don't totally agree with that. Maybe the internet and its sorting power allows that to happen a little more. And yet it also kind of pushes people into tribes more. There's like, you could argue either way, there's sort of opposing ideas there. So I guess that's my observation. My question is, what do you think that we intellectuals and questioners who are trying to spur something could do to get that sort of new narrative to click? I guess that's sort of a huge question, but
Yeah.
Great question.
just
Frank, you want to take it
solve
first?
the answer right
Sure.
there.
Well, this is the first part of what you had to say is why I think party systems are so important. Because you're right, a lot of people are going to just plug themselves into the dominant system, right? If you're basically a status-seeking creature, and that's all you care about, you're not. A lot of people aren't ideological. They really don't care. They just want to rise up in the system, so they'll just plug themselves in. And whatever the two dominant party narratives are going to govern a lot of stuff, because there's a huge momentum, and this is why it's so hard to break them and change them, because there's a lot of people who are just going to take an off-the-shelf ideology and just apply it and just go with it, because that's how they can climb up the system. So yeah, that's in part why getting these things right is so important, because whatever you set up is going to govern so much of what happens. All right, so but the second part is like, how do we do that? All right. Well, this is why Silas had just said something to me about that he thought, that I would disagree about the third party thing. So my view about the forward party is I think they don't realize how it's going to turn out. I'm not against multi-party democracy as a theory. I just think the amount of changes you have to make in our electoral laws to do that is staggering. What I think that third parties often do, and I think forward could be, is a way station being a major party. I think that their trajectory, if they succeed, is they knock off the Republicans and the Democrats and become a major party, just the way the Republicans showed up and knocked off the Whigs. So what do? I think that the goal is always, I have this phrase of a boarding party of ideas. A boarding party being like a ship, right? So a lot of times when you were attacking a ship in the age of sail, you didn't want to sink the other ship. You wanted to take it over. You pull up alongside it, you jump on the deck, and you take control of it.
He's saying we should be political, ideological pirates.
I mean, it's basically that. I think what we're doing, things like this, and what Forward is doing, and there's other movements doing this, is we are building a boarding party of ideas. We are building an idea movement outside the system. And the ultimate goal is either to board one of the major parties and yank out its guts and replace them, or knock one off. And I think that's, so this is why I'm totally on board with Forward is doing. I don't think that what they're doing is going to create a multi-party democracy. I think what they might be doing is creating one impetus for this boarding party. And I think that all of these discussions like this, well, by coming up with these ideas, we have to do it outside the system, because you can't do it within the existing party system. Because if you plug new ideas into a bad machine, it's just going to plug, the machine's just going to chew them up and turn them into whatever it's going to turn them into. You got to do it outside the system. And then once we build a movement, you come up with the ideas first, you get the intellectuals together, the intellectuals come up with the ideas, you put them out into society, it becomes a movement. The movement then boards a major party and replaces it and then reboots the system. So that's how I think we do it.
So I love this question. This is one of my favorite questions. I just want to see by a show of hands, how many people here work in some capacity in writing, the sort of fields where you get to kind of put your ideas out into the world? I just want to see. Okay, so that's great. I'm really excited about that. Yeah. I wholeheartely second what Frank said, and I want to add, when you look at the last two times that the party systems have shifted, in one case in what you would call the leading party, and in the other case what you call the lagging party. What I mean by that is the party that starts first or the party that responds to the other party that started. Both of them were driven by a journal publication. In the case of the modern conservative movement, it was the intellectual circle around National Review, which eventually became a boarding party for the Republican Party and remade it almost unrecognizably.
Yep.
And the work of William F. Buckley and the circle that formed around National Review. Likewise, a generation before, the New Republic and progressivism and the ideology that formed there or became a boarding party, in that case, for the Democrats. So.
There's a couple friends of mine in this room from conservative world, and I'm not going to out any of you, but I would be fascinated to hear some of your thoughts as well, if any of you have it. So, all right, raise your hands. By the way, Silas has to go around another meeting soon, so we're going to try and take about 10 minutes. So raise your hands if you have thoughts. And in the meantime, and Mia, can you take it to the woman in the front, please, to Michelle? In the meantime, I just want to clarify for semi-legal purposes that Frank was being entirely metaphorical when he said about
That is correct.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dunn from Franciscan Action Network. So I just wanted to raise two sort of challenges to what you've been discussing about political parties. So one challenge is, and I'm just curious what you think about these. One challenge is the idea that our political parties are too weak or too ineffective. I mean, I would say there are some people who would say the opposite is true. Our political parties are way too powerful, and they try to just divide the pie between them with gerrymandering, et cetera, that they're trying to bypass the voters and just run things. Okay, so that's one argument, that the parties are not too weak, they're too powerful. The other one is that the parties really don't matter, and I'm thinking here like of Gary Gersel's book, The Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism, right? Where he talks about, what it's really all about is, the big idea of where we are, where we're supposed to be going. And you had the New Deal era, and then you had the neoliberal era, and that is now breaking up. That's our problem right now. And of course, he argues in the book that both the parties, were essentially on the same page with New Deal and with neoliberalism, right? And you alluded to this a little bit,
Yeah.
Frank, in some things you said. So that the argument would be, it's not, the problem is not the parties. The problem is that we don't, we're in that, Gramsci sort of period, where one idea has died and a new one has not yet emerged, and that's what's wrong.
I mean, I would agree with that, but though when I say the parties are weak, it's not that they're not good at winning elections. They've been great at winning elections, but realistically, when's the last time anything significant has happened? They're not good at doing anything anymore. They have no ability to turn ideas into action or even any idea of what to do. And if you look at just think back to any decade before about the 1990s, and you think about what was accomplished, whether it be the interstate highway system or building, the Americans with Disability Act, or, Medicare, Social Security, just every decade, every presidency, there's a list of accomplishments, all of which you would look at today and be like, that's impossible. The only thing that has happened of any significance that I can tell in government since the 90s was Obamacare, one thing. And Obamacare, if you think about it, if it was 1970 and they had done that, it would be an asterisk. I mean, when you look at the Great Society and then you look at Obamacare.
Right, it's like one tiny fraction.
Again, it's Clean Water Act level of stuff, right? It's about the level of significance, like the clean, and it's not, by that I mean, the Clean Water Act, it's a real thing, it's important. It was a significant piece of legislation, but we don't write songs about it. And And that's the level of.
Is that a challenge?
Well,
Schoolhouse Rock.
I don't know how many songs we've written about Medicare. I guarantee somebody's written a song about Medicare. But if you think about it, we really haven't, and think about how like explosive it was that we did Obamacare. We haven't done anything. The parties have done nothing of significance since Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton.
I think there's a moment in the excellent movie Idiocracy, which should be taken seriously, but not literally, where he's giving a speech. We used to do big things in this country, and that is exactly what I'm thinking about.
But it's true.
Just
Yeah.
very, very small point. The parties is being weak is not about, as Frank said, them winning elections. Think about their ability to control their own caucuses, to organize towards shared action. The Republican Party was completely taken over by a guy who wasn't Republican until very recently, and had no power to stop them. They just all turned around and followed. The Democratic Party is having a heck of a time bringing its caucus to heel to do any kind of action. That's the kind of weakness, not the losing elections. They're very good at capturing the system. That's actually the problem that we're trying to solve.
I think we have time for one more question before Silas has to get out of here. So let's take it to the gentleman on the left up here. I mean, yeah, that's left. Yes. Howdy, sir.
Hi, my name is Roger Roundy. I'm an artist and graphic designer. I have a question about the Forward Party's stance on freedom of speech and deplatforming among other people, like say of Donald Trump from Twitter, or dissenting doctors who have a second opinion about COVID. What's the Forward Party stance?
I'm going to rule this in order only if Silas answers it in a way that's relevant specifically to the party shifts that have been going on and this kind of thing.
I think I can.
Yes.
Let me just say that if you're interested in the specific topic of the Forward Party, just go to forwardparty.com and then /DC if you're interested in the local or national. But the thing that I think the Forward Party maybe doesn't talk about itself as, one of the party platform principles is grace and tolerance. And that's a very strange party platform principle, but it's one that I really hold dear. I mean, frankly, as a Christian, I hold dear. The underlying sentiment is sort of a laying down of arms in the culture war. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I think that part of what the toxicity of our current party system is the hostility of the culture war and the way in which it has. I mean, I bet almost everybody through either themselves or knows somebody here who has had a lost relationship about politics that wasn't true a generation ago. And so I think that is a big part of the sentiment. The nitty gritty, as Luke said, I think is perhaps not appropriate for this context, but I would be happy to talk about it. But that sentiment of not being at each other's throats is actually one of the core drivers.
Frank and Silas, I'm going to give each of you about like 2 minutes or whatever to say whatever thoughts you have on this and also the future of your own studies on this kind of thing and how you think all of us should be thinking about the future of American political ideologies. But in a way, of course, that is pluralist and invitational to all this, to keep thinking with you.
I've been talking a lot today, so I don't want to just reiterate what I've said. But I mean, I guess I will end with saying that, see, this is why I think, what I think is so interesting about just listening to the questions in this group and everything is, I just feel like a switch is flipped, because I think 6 months ago, this wouldn't have happened. I think it's really just in this calendar year that people are taking this seriously. And it's gone from something that people have laughed off as that'll never happen to this is something that's going to happen. And I think that's really exciting. And I guess, it has become very trendy to look at this political change and the way that the old system is coming apart with doom and gloom. And sometimes I can get pretty gloomy myself, and I can get very worried about the future. Silas was talking about the future of democracy and all this. But I can't help but also be very hopeful because of the huge opportunity this represents. I think it is an amazing, lucky chance that I get to be alive in one of the small windows where we get to reshape our entire political order around anything we want. Because that means we can make it anything we want. And we can play a role in making it anything we want. And I think once people get on board with that, it's just, I think things are going to get better. It's just a question of how much worse we let things get before we make things better.
Frank, thank you for being here. And I look forward to many conversations on this in the future. Silas.
I agree very strongly with Frank about the Hamilton musical sentiment, how lucky we are to be alive right now.
Yeah.
I'll say that this work of ideological innovation that we're talking about here, of thinking about what the next big question is and how we might solve it and how we might organize ourselves to solve it, I think that is exactly the right question for the intelligentsia that are gathered here and for those who would like to save the republic, if I'm not being too hyperbolic. And I think that work is vital work. So much of the work that I see done in politics, and that I've done myself in politics, and that I have dear friends and family members who have committed to in politics, is just about that next inch, the next inch, just one more vote on this next election. I'm going to robocall 3,000 more people and spam them because 3 of them will vote and then I'll win. And there's such a missing of the forest for the trees. And when I think back to these intellectual circles of the New Republic, of the National Review, and this work of doing the work that doing the thoughtful work of what story, what narrative can bring us together so we can do things together to solve what problem. I think of that work, I just think of it as so vital and so ignored in our current political climate. I will just say as a small closing note that Frank, Luke, and I all participate in this this ideological innovation study group where we literally are trying to do this, hash these out, think of our own ideas. I think more people need to do that kind of work, and I think that some of the people in this room and some people who watch this video are likely some of the ones interested enough to do that. I just want to affirm for you that work is important, that it is not blowing hot air, it is not, wait, this is, we just have to put this down to win the next election. It's actually the thing that can build something durable that could solve these problems that have been heretofore deeply unsolved.
This event was brought together by 3 organizations, Braver Angels, the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and American Purpose, that all, in some sense or another, do things vaguely related to depolarization, civility, bipartisanship, and bridge building. And we didn't talk very much about those specifically in this event, although certainly your question in the back was important, and I look forward to talking with you after this event more deeply on it. But I will say for the preliminary time here that one of the things that I've found both through learning from Silas and Frank in a while and just studying the contours of American politics is that it's so easy in our ideological time when everyone is screaming at you to go one way or to go the other way, to be a certain kind of like political actor that says a few things and behaves a certain way. It's so very easy to miss so many things that you can do, so many opportunities for building common ground in ways that you never imagined was possible, so many opportunities for finding value in something that you otherwise entirely disagree with and disassociate with. And I think that one of the greatest things that depol work can do for intellectual work, and additionally, one of the greatest opportunities that deep creative intellectual work can do for depol work is showcase that if you push down a few of your blenders just long enough, there are strange new coalitions, strange new horseshoes across different ideological contours, and strange new opportunities for politics that were never possible. Now, should civil discourse organizations endorse some of those and so say those are the way forward in politics? I don't really think so. I think that's their job. I think the job of depolarization and civility work is to train those habits, but I do think those habits open up new doors in politics and political theory in some ways. And does that in itself change the ideological constellations of American politics? Probably not. Probably does change a couple lines. And I think mind by mind, soul by soul, person by person is probably about as fast as you can hope to do any major moral change in society. And if we can do that and no faster, then that is the speed that we ought to be doing, especially if we get to talk about what our ideal political parties would look like as we're doing it. So this has been the first event of the Braver Angels DC project. I am working on my own administrative and diplomatic capacities, so stay tuned. But one of these days, you will be getting an email from Braver Angels and from some of our fellow organizations on more events like this. What you just sat through is not a very typical Braver Angels event. This is a forum style thing. We do speakers that are thinking on themes related to
dipole work and bipartisan work and all that kind of thing. But this is not an explicitly Braver Angels event. Braver Angels events that we do have included Braver Angels debates. That's a parliamentary style debate moderated by our wonderful chairs doing all kinds of things, and where anybody in the room can talk. In fact, there's a couple of chairs, and in fact, a great lawgiver of the ancient world of the Braver Angels debates project in this room right now. We do a bunch of different kinds of workshops. We do workshops that are literally family therapy based style workshops, where you get 10 reds and 10 blues in a room to go sit around in a circle and talk about their feelings and learn that they have more in common than they ever imagined. Sound familiar? We have one-on-one conversations, which our wonderful super volunteer Donna Murphy up front has been one of the pioneers on, that opens up these sorts of conversations across multiple divides. And I don't think we've done the post-liberal versus futurist divide yet, but Donna, I'd love to brief you, and maybe we can finish something like that for uses intellectuals like me. At some level, there's just so much different work going on inside our organization that we hope to be bringing to you all here in Washington, D.C., here in the heart of policy world, in ways that are useful and relevant to people who think and act in the ways that we've been talking about here, in the hope that over time, this can just be a resource for helping out our fellow Americans at all levels of society, including all over this broad land and including here in the nation's capital itself. So with that, expect to see some emails from us if you have questions about the work that we're doing. Frank and I at least will be up here for a little bit. Silas is running off to a meeting, so Silas, thank you for being here.
Though if you want to come up to me and hand me a card or send me your contact info if you want to talk, I would love to talk to you. I have a meeting that I'm running at 8. So
he knows Andrew Yang. So anyways, so come up to us. And in the meantime, I'd like to give a final thank you to our wonderful partners over at American Purpose and our wonderful partners and logistical co-hosts over at the National Institute for Civil Discourse. Mia and Bonnie and all the rest, thank you all for doing what you guys are doing, and thank you for this. We look forward to working with you on many things out there. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time on your evening to come listen to a bunch of useless intellectuals who are useful and other things, go talk about some things that we are passionate about and find a lot of interest in. And I'd like to invite all of you to continue the conversation among yourselves, with us, and all this kind of thing, because at the end of the day, is all this talking, is all this discourse? Yeah. But as Silas just said, that's kind of what we Americans do. And that's kind of the basis of the project of self-governance that has been on this continent for quite some time and may be here for quite some time more. And I'll be in this town until the day I die, but I look forward to having these conversations and many more with all of you on this kind of thing as we move forward into this ever-expanding future. So thank you, everybody, and I'll see you at another Braver Angels event very soon.